more unemployment aid, vaccine distribution money, funding for safe schools, and much more. In addition to historic amounts of targeted help at the request of President Trump and his team, the package also included another round of direct checks to households. Whether or not each household needs the help, whether or not their finances have changed dramatically this past year. Yesterday, Secretary Mnuchin announced households should begin receiving these payments as early as today and this week. That is more good news to a lot of people. After Congress and the administration finalized the bipartisan bill, the President expressed interest in further expanding non-targeted direct payment. So, to ensure the President was comfortable signing the bill into law, the Senate committed to beginning one process that would combine three of the President's priorities: larger direct checks, a repeal of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and further efforts to review the integrity of our democracy. Three of the President's priorities in one Senate process. That was the commitment, and that's what happened yesterday when I introduced text reflecting just what the President had in fact requested. Now, Mr. President, House and Senate Democrats want something very different. As they tried to do countless times in the past 4 years, Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer are trying to pull a fast one on the President and the American people. First of all, they're hoping everyone just forgets about election integrity and big tech. They're desperate to ignore those two parts of President Trump's request, and you can draw your own conclusions. And even on the question of larger checks, the Democrats have tried to warp what President Trump actually laid out. Look, it's no secret that Republicans have a diversity of views about the wisdom of borrowing hundreds of billions more to send out more non-targeted money, including to many households that have suffered no loss of income during the crisis. COVID-19 has not affected all households equally, not even close. It's hardly clear that the federal government's top priority should be sending thousands of dollars to, for example, a childless couple making well into six figures who've been comfortably teleworking all year. Our duty is to get help to the people who actually need help, like we did to a historic degree just 4 days ago. But above and beyond that discussion, the Democratic leaders have broken from what President Trump proposed. They quietly changed this proposal in an attempt to let wealthy households suck up even more money. Speaker Pelosi structured her bill so that a family of four would have to earn more than $300,000 in order not to qualify for more cash. A family of three could pull in $250,000 per year, $250,000, and still qualify for some money. And Democratic leaders want to call this scheme, quote, survival checks. Only my friends, Speaker Pelosi and Democratic leader, could look at households in New York and California who make $300,000, in households where nobody has been laid off, where earnings did not even drop during the past year, and conclude these rich constituents of theirs need, quote, survival checks financed by taxpayer dollars and borrowed money. Everyone sees the game here. These are the same Democrats who proudly blocked the entire aid package for months because they tried to hold out for special tax cuts for rich people in blue states. Now they say it's a matter of survival to send another boatload of cash to people making $300,000, regardless of whether they've experienced any disruption at all this past year. Even the liberal Washington Post today is laughing at the political left for demanding more huge giveaways with no relationship to actual need. Here's what the Washington Post wrote. Especially wrong-headed is the progressive left, spearheaded by Senator Bernie Sanders, who depicts the $2,000 as aid to desperate Americans despite huge amounts destined for perfectly comfortable families. That's from the editors of the Washington Post. The Wall Street Journal, usually their opposite number, actually agrees. These non-targeted checks are unnecessary, and struggling households can access targeted support like expanded jobless benefits, food stamps, child care subsidies, and much more. The liberal economist Larry Summers, President Clinton's Treasury Secretary and President Obama's NEC director, says, quote, "There's no good economic argument for universal $2,000 checks at this moment." He points out the CARES Act and the brand new law will already have boosted overall household income relative to the economy back to its pre-pandemic levels, if not higher. If specific struggling households need still more help after the huge historic package that was just signed into law 4 days ago has taken effect, then what they will need is smart, targeted aid, not another fire hose of borrowed money that encompasses other people who are doing just fine. So in my view, colleagues like Senator Cornyn and Senator Toomey have pointed this out persuasively. But more broadly, here's the deal. The Senate is not going to split apart the three issues that President Trump linked together just because Democrats are afraid to address two of them. The Senate's not going to be bullied into rushing out more borrowed money into the hands of Democrat rich friends who don't need the help. We just approved almost $1 trillion in aid a few days ago. It struck a balance between broad support for all kinds of households and a lot more targeted relief for those who need help the most. We're going to stay smart, we're going to stay focused, and we're going to continue delivering on the needs for our nation. Now, Mr. President, I move to proceed to calendar number 480S3985.
The clerk will report the motion.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 480S3985, a bill to improve and reform policing practices, accountability, and transparency.
I understand that there are two bills at the desk due a second reading in block.
Clerk will read the titles of the bills for the second time.
S5085, a bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to increase the additional 2020 recovery rebates, to repeal Section 230 of the Communications Act of 1934, and for other purposes. H.R. 9051, an act to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to increase recovery rebate amounts to $2,000 for individuals and for other purposes.
In order to place the bills on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I'd object to further proceeding in block.
Objection having been heard, the bills will be placed on the calendar.
Now,
Mr. President.
Democratic Leader.
Now, Mr. President, I was prepared this afternoon to speak about the business the Senate must address, and I will do that. But first, I must respond to the recent announcement by the junior senator from Missouri that he intends to contest the certified votes of the Electoral College when Congress meets to count those votes next week. The process for electing American presidents is provided for in our Constitution and laws. The process has been followed fully, fairly. The results have been duly certified by the governors of the states, and they've been reviewed and confirmed by the courts many times over. The result is that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won the election by overwhelming margins in both the popular vote and electoral vote. The Biden-Harris ticket received more than 81 million votes, more than any ticket in American history. That was over 7 million more votes than Trump-Pence. The Biden-Harris ticket won the Electoral College, 306-232, the very same total that President Trump called a landslide for himself then, just 4 years ago. Since the election process, President Trump and his acolytes have lost more than 50 lawsuits, falsely claiming fraud or other irregularities in the conduct of the 2020 election, including the unanimous decision by the Supreme Court to dismiss a lawsuit brought by the Attorney General of Texas and more than half the Republican members of the House. And today we heard from the junior senator from Missouri that he intends to object to election results, particularly in Pennsylvania, a state where the Trump campaign and its allies have brought no fewer than 13 lawsuits and lost every single one. many with Republican judges ruling. There have been only 3 individuals, 3, charged with voter fraud in Pennsylvania, and in each case, the person voted for Trump. The effort by the sitting President of the United States to overturn the results is patently undemocratic. The effort by others to amplify and burnish his ludicrous claims of fraud is equally revolting. This is America. We have elections, we have results, we make arguments based on the fact and reason, not conspiracy and fantasy. On January 6th, the Congress will meet to formally recognize the Electoral College result. There is a very clear process to handle and dispense with objections from members of Congress to the counting of the result, and that's just what we'll do, dispense with them. The Congress will ratify the Electoral College's decision that Joe Biden will be president and Kamala Harris will be vice president on January 6th. And make no mistake about it, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will be sworn in as president and vice president on January 20th. Now, let me return to the matters at hand. Today, the Senate will begin the process of overriding the president's veto on the annual defense bill. The House has already overridden the veto by a comfortable margin. I expect the Senate to follow suit and enact the NDAA into law over President Trump's evolving and ridiculous objections. Congress has passed the annual defense bill for 59 years in a row. It's an important opportunity to ensure our defense and security policies reflect the evolving challenges of our world and provide our service members and their families, as well as the Defense Department civilians, the support, resource, and training they need. The particular legislation includes a pay raise for troops, provisions that will allow the executive branch to be better postured and identify breaches to American cybersecurity, and in the wake of the SolarWinds hack, that might be a good policy to enact. Nonetheless, President Trump vetoed this legislation because it provides for renaming military installations that honor Confederate military leaders, or maybe because it doesn't address an unrelated social media issue. Think about it for a moment. The president vetoed a pay raise to living American soldiers in order to defend the honor of dead Confederate traitors. Well, the Senate will soon have an opportunity to override the president's objection and do right by those brave Americans who wear the uniform. Now, as I said yesterday, there are two major issues before the Senate right now: the annual defense bill and the vital and important effort to send $2,000 stimulus checks to American families. There are only a few days left in this session, and the Senate should consider both issues before adjourning. There's a very simple solution to this dilemma. Leader McConnell should bring both measures up for a vote and let the chips fall where they may. I believe both measures, the defense override and the $2,000 checks to American families, will both pass. But at the very least, the Senate deserves the opportunity for an up or down vote on increasing the individual payments to the American people. So at the end of my remarks, I will ask the Senate to set a time tonight for a vote on the House bill to provide $2,000 checks. The Republican leader objected to a similar request I made yesterday, and it appears he may be considering a different bill that packages stimulus checks with other unrelated and partisan policies. So I want to be very clear about one thing. There is no other game in town beside the House bill. The only way to get to the American people the $2,000 checks they deserve and need is to pass the House bill and pass it now. The House is recessed for the year. Any modification or addition to the House bill cannot become law before the end of this Congress. It's a way to kill the bill. Make no mistake about it. Either the Senate takes up and passes the House bill, or struggling American families will not get $2,000 checks during the worst economic crisis in 75 years. Over the past few days, the idea of increasing direct payments to the American people has united folks from all points of the political spectrum. And I salute the senator from Vermont for the good job he has done in bringing this forward to the American people's attention. An overwhelming bipartisan majority in the House supports the $2,000 checks. Senate Democrats strongly support these 2,000 checks. And our unlikely ally, President Trump, this morning tweeted, 2,000 ASAP. For once, Democrats agree with something on President Trump's Twitter feed. Let's send $2,000 ASAP to working Americans who are facing the hardest and darkest days of the pandemic. After all the insanity that Senate Republicans have tolerated from President Trump, his attacks on the rule of law and independent judiciary, the conduct that led to his impeachment, is this where Senate Republicans are going to draw the line? $2,000 checks to the American people? That is a bridge too far? Please. For the awareness of my colleagues, we can have this vote tonight and send the bill directly to the President's desk for signature. We can vote on the NDAA bill tonight and finish the Senate's business before the end of the year. All it takes is our Republican colleagues consenting to a simple vote on the House bill to provide $2,000 checks to the American people. Yes or no? Up or down? Do you support sending $2,000 to the American people or not? Let's have the vote. And so, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 9051, a bill received from the House to increase recovery rebate amounts to $2,000 for individuals, that the bill be read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Object.
Objection is heard. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Mr. President.
The senator for Vermont.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to concur with what Senator Schumer said. And what he said goes beyond economics. It goes beyond the desperation that tens of millions of working families are facing. It goes beyond the struggles of the people of Vermont or Kentucky. And let me just make it clear for the majority leader that 10 out of the poorest 25 counties in the United States of America are located in Kentucky. So maybe my colleague, the majority leader, might want to get on the phone and start talking to working families in Kentucky and find out how they feel about the need for immediate help in terms of a $2,000 check per adult. And I have the strong feeling that the people of Kentucky will respond no differently than the people of Vermont or New York. This last poll that I saw had 78% of the American people saying that they wanted and needed that type of help. But this discussion, frankly, is not just about the economic struggling of working families in this country. It's not just the massive levels of income and wealth inequality. It's about basic democracy. Now, what we have to do here on the floor, whether it's Senator Schumer or Senator McConnell or me, we got to talk in legalese. That's the language of the United States Senate, and the stuff sounds pretty complicated to the average person. But all that Senator Schumer and I are asking of the majority leader is a very simple request. Allow the members of the United States Senate to cast a vote. If you want to vote against $2,000 checks for people in your state, vote against it. I see Senator Toomey here. He has been clear about it. I suspect he will vote against it. I respect his opinion. But all that we are asking for is a vote. What is the problem? In the House, over 2/3 of the members of that body, including 44 Republicans, voted to say that at this time of economic desperation, working families deserve help and they deserve a $2,000 check. And as Senator Schumer just indicated, we have a very unlikely ally in President Trump. Nobody here has disagreed with Trump more times than I have. And yet here is what the leader of the Republican Party says. He says $2,000 ASAP. So even on this issue, amazingly enough, the President of the United States is right. So what all of this comes down to, my fellow Americans, is not even whether you agree with Senator Schumer and myself and 78% of the American people, or you agree with Senator McConnell, and I suspect Senator Toomey, that's fine. It's called democracy. We have differences of opinion. All that I am asking is give us a vote. What's the problem? Allow the United States senators to cast a vote as to whether or not they are for the $2,000 check or whether they're against it. We will need, as I understand it, 60 votes to win. That's a big hurdle. I don't know that we're going to win. There are a number of Republicans, to their credit, who have said they're ready to vote for it. I suspect there may be more, when given the opportunity, who will vote for it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we will lose. I think that would be unfortunate. But all that I am asking for right now is give us the opportunity to vote. What is the problem with that? So, Mr. President, with that, I will now go to Senate legalese and say, quote, I ask unanimous consent that at 11:30 a.m. on Thursday, December 31st, the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 9051 to provide a $2,000 direct payment to the working class, that the bill be considered, read a third time, and the Senate vote on passage of the bill without intervening action or debate. Further, that if passed, the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table. Further, that immediately following the vote on H.R. 9051, the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of the veto message on H.R. 6395, that the Senate immediately vote on passage of the bill, the objections of the President to the contrary notwithstanding, with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
The Senator for Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. Let me start by pointing out we are not in the same place that we were in back in March. Our economy is in nothing like the situation we faced during a moment in March when this body came together and voted unanimously, I believe, for the most extraordinary aid package, financial stimulus bill, however you care to characterize it, in the history of the world by far. Remember, where we were was we had closed down the economy. To a very large degree, the American economy had stopped functioning because state governments around the country decided they had to close it down. We can discuss, we can argue about whether that was a good decision or not, but given the limited knowledge we had about the nature of the COVID-19 threat, it was deemed to be the right thing to do. So we were on the verge of having no economy. That's never happened before in our history. So what did we do? We decided this calls for extraordinary measures. And we would try to use federal dollars as a substitute for the economy, just replace lost income on a massive, unprecedented scale. And we did. Almost $3 trillion we approved in that legislation. At the time, we included $1,200 per person. You could make an argument that that was an extremely inefficient use of those $1,200 per person, but at the time, given the circumstances, I understood why we didn't have many good options, and that was something we decided to do. So where are we now? We're in a very different place. Our economy is not in a free fall. Our economy is in a recovery mode. We're not back to where we want to end up. We're not back to where we were before March, but we've taken big steps in that direction. The economy grew at 33% last quarter. 33%. That's a tremendous recovery that is underway. More than half of all the people who lost their jobs earlier this year have regained their jobs. So we're not finished yet, but that's a huge step along the way. And now we're being told, after passing another extraordinary bill, this one almost $1 trillion, and including $600 per person, that that's not enough. We need to do $2,000 per person, despite the fact that we know for sure, we know for a fact, that the large majority of those checks are going to go to people who had no lost income. How does that make any sense at all, Mr. President? We know for sure that the majority of these people had no lost income. They didn't lose their jobs. And yet we're going to send them not $600, not the $1,200, but $2,000. So think about this. A married couple who both are working and have 2 kids, maybe they work for the federal government like 2 million odd people do. Maybe they work for a large company, the vast majority of which did not have large numbers of layoffs. So this 2-child, 2-income couple that makes 6 figures had no interruption, no diminishment of their income whatsoever. They're going to get $8,000 of money we don't have that is going to be either borrowed or printed. That's what it's all going to come down to. Mr. President, there are people who are still suffering from the economic fallout of this terrible COVID crisis. There's no question about it. We know there are people who are concentrated in a handful of industry for the most part, not exclusively, but people who have worked in the restaurant industry, people who worked for hotels, travel, entertainment. So many of those people are still out of work, and their prospects of getting their old jobs back are not good in the short run. I sure hope they'll be good in the medium-term run, if not sooner. And our bill addressed that. It addressed that problem. How do we do that? With a new round of PPP loans, which are really grants to small businesses if they'll keep their workforce intact. Expansion of unemployment insurance benefits so that people who have historically been ineligible remain eligible so they can continue to collect unemployment benefits. An increase in the amount of unemployment benefits, a $300 a week overlay of federal money on top of whatever their state program is. $600 per person regardless of whether they lost income. All of that was passed just a few days ago. And now we're told we need to come back immediately right now and make sure that we're sending $2,000 checks to people who had no lost income. So for that reason, Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard. Senator for Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. President, very much. And I rise to echo the sentiments of the senator from Vermont. He is right. The Republicans are wrong on this issue, on every single part of this debate. Senator Sanders is right. The Republicans are wrong. We're in the middle of an unprecedented crisis in our country. We have a health care crisis. We have an unemployment crisis. We have a hunger crisis. We have a housing crisis. We have an addiction crisis. We have a moral crisis in this country. The United States government should be responding to the needs, to the desperation of families in our country at this time. There's a crisis of faith that the American people have in its government's ability to respond to human suffering. Well, this institution has been created to respond to human suffering. That's our job. Tony Fauci has made it very clear that the worst of the pandemic is ahead of us, not behind us. We know what's coming, and yet we are not responding. We know this is not going away soon, and yet we are not responding. A program, Operation Warp Speed, was created to create a vaccine. But because for 7 months the Republicans have refused to fund the public health system of our country at the state and local level, we have Operation Snail Speed to put the vaccinations in the arms of the American people. It was anticipatable. Tony Fauci and others were warning us back in May, in June, in July. There would be a second wave, and the second wave could be bigger. We got the warning. The Republicans refused to heed that warning. And here we are now without the public health infrastructure to deal with the overflow capacity in emergency rooms and ICUs all across the country, while simultaneously asking those same medical institutions to put vaccinations in the arms of healthy people without the resources provided by the federal government to help those states and local communities to deal with that crisis. Sometimes Daniel Patrick Moynihan would say that when you deal with an issue, you deal with it with benign neglect. If you don't want to help or you don't want to hurt, deal with benign neglect. What's happened with the Republicans this year is that they've created a program which is designed neglect. It's an actual plan not to provide the funding, not to provide the help for those families, for those communities, for those institutions that are now being overwhelmed and asked on top of that to put this extra burden of putting vaccinations in people's arms, but without the extra resources. And what do? On the Republican side, they throw out these red herrings, so many red herrings that you need to build an aquarium in the well here of the Senate in order to deal with all of them, that gets away from the central issue. Yes or no, up or down, will you provide $2,000 to Americans who are going to need it through what Tony Fauci is saying will be the worst part of this pandemic? Yes or no, up or down, where do they stand on this issue? Here's what we do know. Republicans seem more focused on funding the Defense Department than they do funding the defenseless in our country. And Americans are becoming more defenseless as each day goes by. The headlines are screaming that this panic that is absolutely understandable and based upon fact is sweeping our country. There is protection which the federal government should be providing to these families. We hear it. They're hungry. They could be without their homes. The addiction crisis is rising. They need help in their families. So from my perspective, we have a moment in time. And Donald Trump happens to agree with us, even a broken clock is right twice a day. And we do agree with him. He is right. We do need this help, which we should be providing to these families. And as we watch more and more of our American loved ones fall sick and die, families are facing a new and unprecedented hardship. They're having to make impossible decisions to whether to put food on the table or keep the heat on through the cold winter months. And the United States government has an obligation to help working people who, through no fault of their own, are seeing all of the things that they care about, all of the success that they have worked for, and all the financial security they have earned be washed away. And yet the Republicans want to put another Operation Snail Speed in place. The damage to these families is anticipatable. We can see what is unfolding. Dr. Fauci is telling us we're at the worst part of the pandemic and it's going to continue. So let us act in anticipation. Louis Pasteur used to say that chance favors the prepared mind. That is what Dr. Tony Fauci is telling us. Let us prepare. Let us help families prepare for what is about to arrive. Just in Massachusetts alone, 21,000 new people applied for unemployment insurance in the week before Christmas. Food banks across Massachusetts, across the country, are seeing double-digit increases in demand with families who never faced food insecurity before. People are literally starving, cold, and without homes. And meanwhile, the majority leader and Republican leadership would rather head home for the new year and ignore the financial and health crises that are taking a toll on our families. For millions of Americans, this will be a New Year's holiday where they won't know if they can put food on the table that night. Republicans are claiming that giving $2,000 in direct cash payments to working Americans would be too expensive, that it would inflate our national deficit, that our budgets are already bloated. I have to ask, though, where was this outrage when Republicans blew up our national deficit to give a $1.5 trillion tax cut to billionaires and corporations? These are the crocodile tears from the right as Americans are shedding real tears, thinking about where their next meal will come from. The eviction notice on the front door, or losing health care in the midst of this crisis. And Americans are actually tired of being told that $600 is, quote, sufficient as an amount of money, as relief, as billionaires receive their tax breaks and grow their wealth by the trillions of dollars during this crisis. The rich get richer, and the rest are there, left suffering. They've had enough of being told that there just isn't the money for support for the well-being of their communities when they can see tax breaks going to those companies that are actually laying off workers. And Americans are tired of being let down by their government time and time again as Donald Trump and his Republican allies have abandoned them during this response to the pandemic. Americans need support. They need to be able to trust their government, and they need $2,000 now. So that's the issue. Yes or no, up or down, on providing $2,000 to Americans to help them make it through the worst part of this crisis. So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that at 12:30 p.m. on Thursday, December 31st, the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 9051, a bill to provide $2,000 direct payment to the working class, that the bill be considered read a third time and the Senate vote on passage of that bill without intervening action or debate. And further, that if passed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and that immediately following the vote on H.R. 9051, the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of the veto message on H.R. 9395, that the Senate immediately vote on passage of the bill, the objections of the President to the contrary notwithstanding, with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
The Senator for Texas.
reserving the right to object, Mr. President. Speaker Pelosi's second bite at the apple, just after we voted on a $900 billion bill that's now been signed into law by the President of the United States, is not the way to send relief to the hardest hit Americans. Under this legislation, a family of 5 with an annual income of $350,000 would receive a stimulus check. This is reminiscent of the HEROES Act that the House passed, which cut taxes for millionaires and billionaires. This isn't about helping the people that need it the most. This is about helping millionaires and billionaires and people who, frankly, have not suffered the hardship economically that others have during this pandemic. The median household in my state is $60,000. And the Speaker wants to send taxpayer-funded assistance to folks earning nearly 6 times that much. Even the Washington Post editorial board agrees this is bad policy. And it doesn't differentiate between people who've been receiving a paycheck during this pandemic, like government employees, and people who simply, by virtue of their job, have been put out of work and not receiving any income, or maybe at best unemployment compensation. The Speaker's bill isn't about targeting folks who've lost their jobs or seen their income reduced. It's a far cry from the additional assistance President Trump requested for the hardest hit Americans. The reality is this bill would spend roughly $300 billion more on folks who aren't even experiencing a financial strain from the pandemic. We need to focus on the people who've been hurt. That's what our COVID-19 relief bill that was just recently signed into law is designed to do, and I dare say this is not going to be the last time we visit this topic. If there's more we need to do, I'm confident we will do it. But today and this way is not the right way to do it. I object.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard. The Senator for Illinois.
Mr. President, I've listened carefully and watched 3 occasions on the floor of the Senate this afternoon where Senator Schumer, Senator Sanders, and Senator Markey have tried to create an opportunity where the Senate would actually come together and vote, where the Senate might make a decision based on the merits of this issue rather than to keep talking around the issue. What is at stake is a substantial sum of money for families which are in the midst of the struggle of their lives. $2,000, characterized a few moments ago by my friend from Texas as Speaker Pelosi's idea. Well, I might remind him it was also Donald Trump's idea, and still is. And the President has told us this morning that we should move on this as quickly as possible, and though I don't often come to the floor to agree with the President, he's right. In this instance, he's clearly right. And what will we do now? We are calling senators back together in Washington from far reaches across the United States. This morning, I received some email and text messages from some of our colleagues hopping on airplanes at 6 a.m. on the West Coast, heading out here to face a vote. What is this vote all about? Well, first is to override the veto of the President when it comes to the defense authorization bill. This was certainly something that was occasioned by one senator, the junior senator from Kentucky, who forced us into a position where that vote needed to be taken here. It could have been handled much more efficiently and to the benefit of all members if it was scheduled for the weekend when we were resuming the new session of Congress. But he insisted, and we're returning and frankly putting in peril, again, in the midst of a pandemic, members of the Senate who are traveling from all far-flung reaches of this country to be part of this action in Washington. But it isn't just the junior senator from Kentucky who is having us sit here in Washington and wait for things that could be taken care of with dispatch. It is a senior senator from Kentucky as well. He has decided that we will not get a vote on the House measure to increase the payments to $2,000 a year. Make no mistake, there is only one way to bring this relief to the families of America. It is to pass the bill already enacted by the House of Representatives. A bill which received 44 Republican votes in addition to a substantial number of Democrats, only 2 voting no. 44 Republican votes joined with the Democrats to call for this measure, which many are decrying on the floor here as class struggle or whatever their argument might be. There is no other measure, including Senator McConnell's alternative, which has any ghost of a chance to help the families of this country with this $2,000 benefit. The only thing that will do it, the only one thing that will do it, is this bill that has already passed the House of Representatives. The House is in recess. When they're going to return is uncertain. They certainly don't have the time to work through the regular order of business and consider any new legislation, even if we could send it to them in time, which I believe is very doubtful. And so it's up to Senator McConnell to decide right here and now. Are we going to come together as a Senate this afternoon, 5 o'clock, when we're supposed to be back and voting, and get this matter done? Bring it to the Senate for a vote. Let's have this vote up or down. Let the Democrats and Republicans express their will on behalf of the families of this country. I couldn't agree more with the senator from Massachusetts and his characterization of what families face across this country, and certainly in my home state of Illinois. I just wonder if any of the Republican senators who are downplaying this economic crisis facing these families have really looked into the issue. This morning in the senator's home state of Texas, they showed an early morning television show of the cars that were lining up for food banks. Long lines of people waiting for food banks. And they interviewed some of them in Texas who told heartbreaking stories of how they once were volunteers at the same food bank and now were dependent on it for a helping hand if they were going to be able to feed their families. These were people who were not lazy at all. Misfortune has come their way, and the question is, will we help? This is our opportunity today with the measure that passed the House of Representatives. Not some theory of some legislation might be considered tomorrow. Today, let's have this vote today, this evening. When the senators have returned, let's determine whether or not this House-passed measure for $2,000 is going to be enacted into law and sent to the president, who is clearly anxious to sign it. That, to me, is the reasonable thing to do. In fact, it may even sound like the United States Senate taking a vote on a timely issue after a debate. We do it so seldom around here. I think we've lost our muscle memory when it comes to this activity in the Senate. It's time to return to it. I thank the senator from Vermont, the senator from Massachusetts, and of course the Democratic leader for bringing this issue before us this afternoon. But it shouldn't end with our great speeches. It ought to end with an important vote for the people of this
President,
country.
would the senator from Illinois yield for a question?
Happy to yield.
The senator for Texas.
Mr. President, I wonder if the senator from Illinois would consider pairing their request for $2,000 direct payment with a liability shield provision that would guard businesses that have been operating in good faith and following the guidelines put out by public health and government institutions, and preserve a right to sue for reckless and willful disregard of the rights for others. Would the senator consider pairing those two together?
I would say, in response to my colleague, I know his passionate defense of the notion for immunity from liability for corporations in America. He has introduced a lengthy bill on the subject. I don't believe that is consistent with keeping this nation safe during a pandemic, and certainly is not responsive to any onslaught of lawsuits. The senator might be interested to know that the number of medical malpractice cases filed in the name of COVID-19 since the onset of this current pandemic is slightly higher than the total number of lawsuits filed by Donald Trump in protesting the results of the November 3rd election. This is not a tsunami of lawsuits. I believe we can take reasonable measures to support and defend those corporations and companies which are making a good faith effort to comply with public health standards and protect their employees and customers. His bill, I'm afraid, goes way too far.
Mr. President,
The senator for Vermont.
Let me concur with my friend from Illinois on the issue. And I have a question for my colleague from Texas. Very simple question. You are concerned about the issue of corporate liability. I get that. I happen not to agree with you. You're entitled to your opinion. You may or may not be concerned about Section 230 of the 1996 Federal Telecommunications Bill. That's fine, too. We may have a discussion about how we protect American democracy. It's a good discussion as well. But I have the strong feeling, Senator Cornyn, that in Texas, as in Vermont, you know what? People are really not talking about corporate liability. It's a good issue. It's an important issue. I don't think they're talking about Section 230. What I think they are talking about, as the senator from Illinois just said, how they're going to feed their kids today. That is the issue. And what I would ask my friend from Texas is, what is your problem with allowing the Senate to vote on whether or not we are going to allow Americans, working class people, to get a $2,000 check? Now, I gather that when that vote comes to the floor, and I hope it comes immediately, you'll vote no. and you'll explain to the people of Texas why you voted that way. That's called democracy. I respect that. But what is your problem with allowing the Senate to have a freestanding vote? There are a number of people on your side, Republicans, who have already come forward and say, yeah, they want to vote for this $2,000 check. Now, if you want to deal with corporate liability, that's fine. Let's deal with it at some point. Bring forth the bill. We can vote on it up or down. All that we are asking for is a simple up or down vote on the issue that tens of millions of people are talking about right now. Will they survive economically in the midst of this terrible pandemic? So I asked my colleague from Texas, what is the problem with allowing the U.S. Senate to vote on the bill passed by the House? And I yield to my colleague from Texas.
Mr. President.
The Senator for Texas.
Mr. President, I would say to our colleague from Vermont, I have no problem with providing assistance, whether it's to public health officials who are trying to struggle with this pandemic, or to provide money for the research for therapeutics or vaccine, which fortunately is now being distributed around the country. I have no objection to direct payments to individuals. I voted for the $1,200 direct payment contained in the CARES Act. I voted for the additional money that's provided for in the most recent COVID-19 legislation. But this legislation that the senator from Vermont is advocating would benefit households with annual income over $350,000. They would get this money. And I would say that one way to deal with this, because of course we negotiated back and forth on the last COVID-19 bill, nobody got everything they wanted, but if our colleagues on the other side of the aisle want an additional financial benefit to people making up to $350,000, why not couple it with liability protection for people who are acting in good faith? This isn't just about corporations, and our colleagues across the aisle know it. This is about schools. This is about churches, synagogues, mosques. This is about every business that's worried that a game of gotcha is going to take place and they're going to end up paying the price. Even if they win the lawsuit, they will not be able to, they're still going to have to pay for the cost of defense, potentially losing their business outright.
All right, if I could...
The senator from Texas has the floor.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
So clearly, our colleagues across the aisle care more about trial lawyers and being able to bring litigation against businesses that have tried to do their best but have struggled dealing with the evolving public health guidance provided by the CDC and other authorities. Clearly, if they're not interested in engaging in a negotiation where people who, through no fault of their own, find themselves victimized by frivolous litigation, then we'd have no alternative but to continue to object to this request.
President,
The senator for Vermont.
if you listen carefully, you understood that my friend from Texas did not answer my question. He has a concern about corporate liability. It's a legitimate debate. You know what? Bring it to the floor. Let's vote it up or down. I will vote against it. You will vote for it. But I asked you a very simple question, not linking things together. Nobody in the real world understands that stuff. That's inside the Beltway stuff. What people in the real world know, and I want to take a moment to read some of these statements, because we have a lot of people on our social media, and we asked the American people, just the other day, we said, tell me, what would a $2,000 check mean to you? What's going on in your lives? And in just over 24 hours, I would say to my friend from Texas, nearly 6,000 people responded. And here is just what a few of them had to say. And we don't have, this is Twitter stuff, so I don't have their names here, and I wouldn't use it publicly anyhow, but this is what they say. One person writes, $2,000 is the difference between keeping our apartment and being evicted. Here's another. $2,000 means I can afford to feed my 3 kids. Another response, quote, it would mean not having to choose between rent and groceries or not having to ration my partner's meds, end quote. Another response, quote, I am raising my grandson with medical needs. I am $4,000 behind on utilities. We need electricity to run his medical equipment, end quote. Here's another response. $2,000 would mean I wouldn't have to worry about making my mortgage payment this month and that I could get my medication, end quote. Another response, $2,000 would mean paying my rent and getting life-saving treatment because I can't afford the $50 copay through my work insurance just to see my neurologist right now, end of quote. And on and on and on. Thousands of people responding. So I want to get back to the point that I want to, again, ask my friend from Texas. You got a concern about corporate liability? Good issue. Bring it to the floor. Let's vote on corporate liability. I would yield for a question from my friend from Illinois.
Yield for a question through the chair. I've listened to the figures that have been used on the floor about families that could qualify for the $2,000. It's my understanding that an individual with an income of $75,000 or less could qualify for the $2,000 payment, and a joint return, husband and wife, $2,000 could be given to them if their income is under $150,000. Is that your understanding?
Understanding. And I think, as Republicans do, they're going to, let it be. But I'll get back to my friend from Texas, Senator Cornyn. We're asking a simple question. You want to bring up corporate liability? Bring it up. You want to bring up Section 230? Bring it up. You want to bring up the man on the moon? Bring it up. But what the American people want now is an up or down vote. Now, you're going to vote against it if it comes to the floor. That's fine. It's your right. Explain it to the people of Texas. I will vote for it. But all that I am asking for is the right as a United States Senator to have the vote. And again, I ask you, what is your problem with members of the United States Senate, including a number of Republicans who have already indicated they would like to vote for this? What's your problem with bringing that up as a single standalone bill, not merged with corporate liability or anything else? What's your problem with that?
Mr. President.
Senator for Texas.
Mr. President, I would say to our colleague from Vermont, this money is not targeted to people who suffered financial losses. It is not targeted to people who suffered financial losses. This money would go to members of your own staff if they meet the financial requirements, other government employees who've suffered no financial loss during this pandemic. We've all suffered in different ways during the pandemic, to be sure, but financially, this money is designed to help the people who need it the most. Why would you send money to government employees that have been receiving their full paycheck during this pandemic?
That's a good question, and then I will have to explain that to the people of the state of Vermont.
The Senator for Texas has the floor.
He asked me a question as I understood it.
The Senator for Texas.
John, did you ask me a question? Did I?
The Senator for Texas.
It was more of a rhetorical question, Mr. President.
The Senator for Texas.
Mr. President, I wanted to come to the floor and talk about what strikes me as something akin to Groundhog Day. Groundhog Day isn't only the day I was born, it's something I feel like we're living through here as we debate the same points over and over and over again, forgetting what it is we've already done, the good things we've done together on a bipartisan basis. We've already appropriated roughly $4 trillion in response to this pandemic, and it's appropriate that we have done so because this was a true public health crisis. But now this is we're seeing politics creep back in an attempt to send money to people who've suffered no financial loss in an untargeted and wasteful sort of way. These relief packages that we passed together have provided hundreds of billions of dollars to support our hospitals and healthcare workers who are on the front lines. And I voted for it, and I think we were right to do so. We've thrown small businesses and their employees a lifeline through the Paycheck Protection Program, and we were right to do so. We've invested in research and development and manufacturing of therapeutics and vaccines that are currently being administered, thank goodness, throughout the country and indeed around the world. And we've sent unprecedented assistance to workers, families, and individuals whose livelihoods have been upended by this crisis. Thanks to President Trump's leadership, Congress has stepped up and met this unprecedented challenge to deliver relief bill after relief bill for the American people. If you had told me a year ago I would have voted this year alone for for roughly $4 trillion worth of spending in this pandemic, I would not have believed you. But I do believe this is the domestic equivalent to World War II, where we have to do everything humanly possible to try to help our fellow man, woman, and child during this pandemic. The latest round of relief came, of course, just this week when President Trump signed the $900 billion rescue package into law. While I'm glad Congress was able to send more relief out the door at the end of the year, I'm disappointed that it took so long to do so. It's amazing the sense of urgency our Democratic colleagues have today, since at least 3 times, maybe 4 times, they blocked our attempts to pass $500 billion relief bills during the course of the summer. In July, our colleagues introduced the HEALS Act, which would have provided just under $1 trillion in relief, covering the same types of policies included in the most recent relief bill: direct payments, unemployment benefits, funding for schools, vaccine, and a host of other priorities. Our Democratic colleagues not only complained about the bill, they called it weak, little, pathetic, and unserious, but they refused to engage in the sort of negotiations that are customary around here when you actually want to solve a problem, or consider anything short of the House's multi-trillion-dollar bill, which they knew had no chance of passing in the Senate because of things like tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires, which had nothing to do with COVID. So our Democratic colleagues dragged their feet. July, August, September, October, November. Months went by and the cases soared and the economic squeeze tightened, and our Democratic colleagues refused to accept any sort of compromise. That was until a few weeks ago when they finally changed their tune right after the election. I'm sure it comes as no surprise that once the holdout agrees to negotiate, things can move pretty quickly. And that's what happened here after the election. Democrats, Republicans, and the administration agreed to a $900 billion package, which looks very similar to the one they dubbed pathetic just a few months ago. In recent days, the president has expressed an interest in doing more, and I have no doubt that we will do more in this area. But Speaker Pelosi's bill goes far beyond what the president is talking about. For one, it would dramatically widen the pool of recipients, enabling wealthy households to qualify for relief checks. This is unacceptable and wasteful. When Congress provided the first round of direct payments through the CARES Act, we did so in a way that sent relief to the hardest hit Americans. Individuals who made up to $75,000 received the full $1,200, and the amount gradually declined as income increased and completely phased out at $99,000. We kept the same formula for the $600 payments provided for under the omnibus and further targeted the relief. Once again, those who made up to $75,000 will receive the full amount, and the amount phases out completely at $87,000. Under the CARES Act, a family of 4 earning up to $150,000 received $3,400. In the most recent rescue bill, the same family would receive an additional $2,400. This was the most effective and targeted way to ensure that assistance goes to those who actually need it, while avoiding sending taxpayer dollars, borrowed, I might add, to those who don't. The House passed legislation would provide $2,000 payments, but it doesn't have a similar structure to keep these payments targeted. Let me give you an example. If this bill were to become law, a person making $100,000 a year would receive a $750 check from the federal government, whether or not they lost income during the pandemic. This isn't someone who used to make that much but was laid off or had reduction in their income. Someone who's currently earning a 6-figure salary would receive an additional $750 from American taxpayers. For families, the income barrier goes higher. As I mentioned a moment ago, if you have a family of 5 with an annual household income of $350,000 a year, that family would receive a stimulus check under the House-passed bill. Now, that's not being smart with taxpayer dollars, and that's not targeted at the people who actually need it. That's a giveaway to people who have not suffered any financial losses during this pandemic. and clearly not targeted at those who need the most help. I mentioned a moment ago that the median income for households in Texas is $60,000 a year. So this family of 5 is earning nearly 6 times as much and would still receive a check from taxpayers. That defies all common sense. Even the Washington Post editorial board dubbed this policy as wasteful because of the huge amounts destined for what they call perfectly comfortable families, close quote. Even though Congress has already provided roughly $4 trillion in relief to the American people, our Democratic colleagues are acting as though this is the first and only way to help our country. Like I said, for them, every day is Groundhog Day. They ignored everything we've done in the past and act like this is the only thing we have or could do. It's just not true. This debate isn't about whether or not Congress should help families who are struggling. We have, and there's no question we'll continue to do so where needed. That's why we provided $1,200 in direct payments to the hardest hit Americans through the CARES Act and an additional $600 through the most recent relief bill. That's why these bills also bolstered state unemployment benefits and expanded them to include independent contractors and self-employed. That's why Congress has passed legislation to provide food assistance to families, keep more hardworking Americans on the payroll, and ensure our economy is on track for a strong recovery. Again, we did this thanks to the leadership of President Trump and by working together in a bipartisan way. Countless Texans have told me about the impact of this relief on their businesses and their families, and we can't lose sight of the progress that has already been made. But future relief must be targeted. We need to support those who need it and avoid sending hundreds of billions of dollars, as this proposal would, to those who don't need it. Throughout the year, I've been an advocate for an incremental approach to these relief bills because I think it's hard to spend $3 trillion and know exactly how that bill is going to work. And indeed, we found out through the CARES Act that the Main Street lending facility, which we funded at roughly $500 billion, it wasn't as useful as we would have hoped. Conversely, the Paycheck Protection Program was more successful than our wildest dreams. And so I think by seeing what works and what doesn't work, we can be better stewards of the taxpayer dollars by spending the money more efficiently and in a more targeted way. This isn't like highway bills or farm bills or defense spending bills where we have an idea about what's needed for individual programs. There was no precedent for this pandemic, no handbook, no clear way to gauge how long this crisis would go on or what would be needed to sustain our response. After the CARES Act passed, we knew it made the most sense to hit the pause button and see what worked well, what didn't, and where more help was needed. As I said, there were certain programs like the Paycheck Protection Program that almost immediately dried up. If I'm not mistaken, in 2 weeks, roughly $350 billion was obligated under the Paycheck Protection Program, a strong indication that we really hit the sweet spot when it came to helping those small businesses. And that's why we added more funding in April, another $320 billion. And we extended the program in July and reinvested in the Paycheck Protection Program again in the omnibus. As I said, there were other places where the money went unspent, but fortunately in the most recent bill, we were able to repurpose hundreds of billions of dollars in unspent funds, again, to target it to where the need was greatest, where it could help the most. There's no question that tens of millions of workers and their families have been hurt by this virus. We all know that. And I think we've all acted together, by and large, responsibly in trying to respond to that. No one will be left out if we have a means and method of targeting this to those people, whether it's direct payments, enhanced unemployment benefits, incentives to their employer to maintain them on payroll. And now that we have the beginning of the distribution of the vaccine, my hope is that in the coming months, we will get back to, if not the new normal, whatever the next normal will be. But we're just a few days from kicking off a new Congress, and I have no reason to believe that our coronavirus relief work is finished here today. As a matter of fact, Vice President Biden said he expects to send us an additional request for help once he assumes office. Once the legislation we have passed has a chance to benefit the American people, we'll see if more relief is needed, and then, if it is needed, we should absolutely do more. I still believe in the wisdom of the incremental approach, and I believe our Democrat friends will join us in responding to true needs of this crisis without month-long delays or irresponsible spending. Countless Texans have told me about the importance of the relief that we provided through direct payments, unemployment benefits, food assistance, and other forms of support by the laws we passed throughout this year. I was proud to support each of these policies, which have eased the financial strains on millions of Texans and other Americans, and will continue to work with my colleagues to provide assistance as our war on COVID-19 rages on. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator for Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've heard a lot of revisionist history this afternoon. Look back in March when Congress did the right thing. The Senate voted unanimously. Because of our efforts, 13 million people were kept out of poverty. We know that because we did relatively generous unemployment insurance. We did the direct payments. We helped with small business loans. But then this Senate thought its work was done for the year. We begged Senator McConnell month after month after month to come back and help. As I said, 13 million people were kept out of poverty because of the work this Congress did in March of this year. But now, since many of these benefits, especially the unemployment benefit and the direct payments were not continued, of course, those benefits expired in August, and we have seen 8 million people drop into poverty in this country since. And yet this Congress, Senator McConnell refused and refused and refused. I hear this revisionist history that Democrats just want to help people that are already affluent, give them more money. Well, remember back in March, the only amendment that we considered, the only amendment that Senator McConnell allowed on the floor of the Senate to the CARES Act, the only amendment was to take away the $600 a week unemployment insurance. The only place Republicans fought was the $600 a week unemployment insurance. That, more than any single thing we did, is why people were kept out of poverty. Now, the best we could do was $300 a week unemployment insurance, the best we could do. And Senator McConnell, in spite of Senator Cornyn and others' comments, Senator McConnell waited. Finally, we were able to do it. The President of the United States threatened to veto it, causing millions of Americans to fall off their unemployment insurance. I mean, we know all that. It's just important to remember all that. But there's one simple question before the Senate this week: are we going to put more money in people's pockets? The American people made it clear on Election Day they want a government that's on their side. This is our chance to deliver for them, to show people whom we serve that we can make a real difference in their lives, which we did back in March. It's pretty simple. The best way to help Ohio workers and families is to put more money in their pockets, not in the bank accounts of the largest corporations and the biggest banks, hoping it will trickle down. We know it never does. The CEOs just pay themselves instead. We know, Mr. President, just recently, more good news for America's CEOs who are able again to do stock buybacks, more dividend distributions. A lot of corporations have made a lot of money more power to them during this pandemic. But those are the corporations that continue to get the big tax breaks. We need to instead directly invest in people who make this country work. It helps people pay the bills and stay in their homes and get through this downturn. It injects money into local economies that really need it. The more money people have, the more they spend at small businesses that are hurting. We know this works. It did in the spring. We came together. We crossed the aisle, passed the CARES Act, expanded unemployment, did direct stimulus checks, keeping 13 million people out of poverty. The bill we passed last week was a good step in that direction, but we should make it stronger. Back in March, my original plan that I tried to negotiate as I sat with Secretary Mnuchin and a handful of other senators was a $2,000 a week, $2,000 per person, adults and children. We called for them to be sent automatically throughout the year, every quarter, as long as we remained in a public health emergency. It's clear now what we could have done and should have done. No one could predict how long this crisis would last. Today, we still aren't sure when everyone will be vaccinated, when the economy will return to full strength. We don't want to sit idly by. We don't want to wonder how bad it could get. We're the strongest, richest country on earth. We have the resources to do something about it. We just need leadership willing to use every tool we have. If they refuse to support this $2,000 per person, if they refuse to support these direct payments, Leader McConnell and Senate Republicans will again make it perfectly clear for the American people whose side they're on. Every time there's a fork in the road, and Senator McConnell and Senate Republicans have to make a decision, either go with corporate interest or go with working families. Every single time they choose corporate interest. They had no problem pouring money into corporate coffers with their tax cut and blowing up the deficit. I remember, Mr. President, just down the hall here, Senator McConnell's office. I remember lobbyists lining up looking for those tax cuts back 3 years ago, and they got those tax cuts. They didn't say anything about government deficits back then, $1.5 trillion added to the deficit. They didn't mind that because that was money going into their contributors' pockets, into big corporate coffers, into the wealth for the wealthiest people in this country. They were all too happy to let the government shovel loans to the biggest banks and companies. But in the middle of the worst crisis of our lifetimes, faced with a chance to give money directly to ordinary Americans, my colleagues claim we can't afford it. That's just simply a lie. We're the richest country on earth. I remember Bill Spriggs, economist at Howard University, told the Banking and Housing Committee in September, "We didn't win World War II by worrying whether or not we could afford it. We're in a global crisis. We marshaled all our vast resources and talents to rise to meet it. We grew the economy from middle class out. We paid down the debt with raising wages. If we've learned anything from this crisis, it should be that we can do the same again." Americans are tired of being told we can't. It's the only answer that Senator McConnell and Senate Republicans ever have with most people's problems. We can't help you. We can't solve your problem. You're on your own. Let's aim higher. Let's deliver for the people we serve. Let's put $2,000 into their pockets, money that will make such a difference for so many families. It will help a mother worried about how she'll pay back rent. It will keep a laid-off restaurant worker from turning to a payday lender. It will allow a father to buy a new computer so his kids are better able to learn online. These are millions of real people we swore an oath to serve, who would breathe a little easier this New Year's if we pass this. So let's be clear about the decision today and this week before the Senate. Are we going to give the people we serve $2,000, or are you going to stand in the way? It's that simple. Let's come together. Let's pass this. Let's make a real difference in people's lives. I note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The senator from Oklahoma. Without objection.
Well, this is, Mr. President, this is what I've considered to be, and I've heard my friend from the Democrat side, the minority side, say the same thing, that this is the most significant bill that we pass every year. It's the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, is one that this will be the 60th year. Is it 60th or 61st year? 60, okay. The 60th year that we've passed this, and it's passed every year. And there are a few moments there where I thought maybe it wasn't going to pass this year. We set a record. Senator Reid and I don't want to set that kind of record. We want to make sure we get this done. The reason this is important is this is the blueprint. This tells us what we're going to be doing with our troops. I could make an argument that it's really we are in the most dangerous situation I think that we've been in before. I've often talked about the good old days when we had the Cold War with the two superpowers. We knew what the Soviet Union had. They knew what we had. Mutual assured destruction meant something at that time. But now it's different in a lot of respects because you have rogue countries out there who have weapons and have abilities to wipe out nations, and that's why it's so significant. So anyway, we suffered through a little bit of a problem back during the Obama administration. During the last 5 years, which would have been from 2010 to 2015, he in his budget, he downgraded the military by 25%, and that's the same time that during that time frame that China increased theirs by 83%. So it's a scary world out there, and it's one that, to me, I have no doubt that this is the most important bill that we'll pass all year, because we got our kids they're out there right now. They're in the trenches, and we have to support them, and that's what it's all about. And I do want to mention how many people are involved in this thing. We're actually starting this right now. We're starting on next year's NDAA. And so this started a year ago. And I mean, the ones working on this, they were working on, you had Liz King and John Bonzel heading up the minority and the majority part of the committee, doing a great job and working every weekend, almost every weekend, and with a very large staff, all specialists in certain areas, and they've got a bill. So I think that I'm very proud of the bill that we have this year. I think that it passed when it had this in the Senate as 84 to I think it was 84 to 14, I think it was. I think there were a couple of people not here. But that's the largest, that didn't happen very often to pass a bill with those margins, and we did. So this is a long tradition. We've got to support our troops. They're in there doing the right thing. And it's been a joy, personally, for me to be working with Senator Reid, and we together kind of provided the leadership in this thing. We didn't work as hard as the staff did, I have to admit that, but we were there, and I'm very proud of this bill. So right now we have kids that are overseas, and they deserve the pay that was increased, would be increased when this bill is passed. Right now we have critical areas like pilots and engineers, doctors that are in short supply. And because of the fact that we've had up until the pandemic, we had a good, probably I would argue the best economy we've had in my lifetime. Well, that's good news, of course, but it's bad news in one way, because it's hard to keep the people in those critical fields. Pilots, for example, they have an opportunity to get out and do things that are, there's jobs out there that are paying a lot more, and so we have to have them on the flight hours, and if something happens and they are out, there are a lot of jobs on the outside that are paying more, And so we just have to make sure that we keep the resources in the right place to do the right job. And so I think this is I know this procedural vote today that's going to bring us this for the next couple of days to pass the Defense Authorization Bill. And it's all about the guys and the gals in the field. And we owe it to them. And this is going to be the 60th year, because I anticipate that this is going to be it's going to pass with very large numbers. With that, I'd yield the floor.
For Rhode Island.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to rise and discuss the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. First, I'd like to salute the chairman. He has done an extraordinary job. We have both served on the committee for many years, and this is probably the most challenging year we've had. Many different factors, the pandemic, the virtual hearings, all those things. And this has been particularly challenging, and the chairman at every point stood up to the challenge and led us, and I want to thank him for that, and it was a pleasure working with him. We all recognize that this legislation passed both chambers, the House and the Senate, by overwhelming bipartisan majorities. And it's very important legislation. That's why it earned this bipartisan support. It enhances our national security, it strengthens our military readiness and defense capabilities, it protects our forces and their families, and supports the defense industrial base. Yet, despite all that it does for our troops and their families, President Trump waited until the 10th day after we received it and vetoed it, the last day he could exercise his veto. And that was December 23rd, which made quite a Christmas for our military personnel and for all of my colleagues who are here today to start the process of responding to that veto. Now, the House already took the first step. It returned on Monday, and once again, by an overwhelming vote, over 300 members of the House, it overrode the president's veto. And now we face the same task in the Senate, and it's my hope we can quickly and resoundingly override the president's veto and provide our troops with what they need. And I will echo what the chairman said. You can go through all of the thousands of pages, literally, but what is the most significant aspect of this legislation is keeping faith with the men and women who wear the uniform of the United States. And so if anyone has any thoughts about their vote, just think about those men and women who are all across the world putting their lives at risk while their families share that risk and that sense of danger and sacrifice. That is what I think has motivated the chairman and myself and all of our colleagues, I must say, on the committee and throughout this Senate to work hard to get this bill passed. Now, there are several reasons being advanced by the president for suggesting that this bill should be vetoed and the veto should be upheld. One reason is that he claims the bill fails to include critical national security measures. Yet this legislation provides critical tools and authorities for the Department of Homeland Security to perform network hunting in federal networks, tools and authorities to counter the SolarWinds hack, which is possibly the largest intrusion into our system we've ever seen by a foreign country. We do not yet know the extent and the degree of intrusion that we have suffered. In fact, we weren't aware of this intrusion for many, many months. And one of the disconcerting factors is that it was discovered by a private company that's one of the most, if not the most, sophisticated cyber intrusion experts in the world, and yet they were penetrated. So we have a serious, serious situation in our hands. And this legislation starts giving basic tools, allowing our cybersecurity experts to go into other departments to look at their procedures, their policies, all of their cyber activities, and recommend corrections. So In fact, this bill has done more, I think, for cyber based on the work of the Solarium Committee, which was chaired by Angus King and Congressman Fitzpatrick of Wisconsin, and also aided significantly by my colleague Jim Langevin of Rhode Island. But they put the work together, and we took a lot of their work and put it in this bill, so there is absolutely no credence to the issue that we have not dealt with national security and cyber intrusions in particular. Then again, the president, his message wrote that one of the reasons is the failure to essentially repeal Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. But this issue has nothing to do with the military, nothing at all. It was designed years ago to provide legal protections to social media companies so that it could start expanding and growing. And frankly, it's worked beyond, I think, our wildest imaginations, and everyone recognizes it should be reformed. But reform requires thoughtful, responsible analysis of the legislation, the effects of the legislation. It should offer both sides the opportunity to explain positions. None of that was done, and none of that can be done before we conclude this legislative session. So it's more, I think, a personal feud of the president, this Section 230 issue, than it is one of careful, deliberate, thoughtful legislation by the Senate. There's another reason that's been the president has used, and that is we have established a commission to make recommendations for the renaming and removal of symbols, displays, monuments, and paraphernalia that honor or commemorate Confederates who have served voluntarily with the Confederacy. There is a clear exemption, by the way, for gravestones that we will absolutely respect. But these individuals, many of them who are on active service with our Army, Navy at the time, decided to consciously fight against the United States of America. It's that simple. And yet we have bases that are named after them. The president said this is a part of the American heritage and victory and freedom, but again, these are named after men who took up arms against the United States. And in some cases, in most cases, they weren't particularly exemplary generals. There's some exceptions. And it was done in a way that I think was not to honor the service of these individuals, but to advance other forces. So it's time, I think, that this history be changed, that this chapter be closed, and the senior Defense Department officials have indicated they're opening to these changes. There's bipartisan support and cooperation on this issue. It passed the committee, it passed the floor, passed the House. Now it's in this legislation. When the president viewed the bill, he also said it's a gift to China and Russia, and I would strenuously disagree. This is one of the strongest bills yet on countering the threat that China poses to the United States and our partners, including allies such as India, Taiwan, and other countries in the regions. Among the provisions of this legislation is the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. Now, that's a new authority for the Department of Defense, modeled after the European Deterrence Initiative, and authorizes an additional $150 million in funding. This was the work, and I was proud to collaborate, but the lead was the Chairman Inhofe, and I was his co-pilot on that one. But this is the first time we've really stepped back and said, we have a new threat, significant threats are rising in the Pacific. We have to take a holistic review of strategy, capabilities, equipment, and we have to make this top priority. So rather than doing nothing about China, I think we've made one of the most significant steps forward in consciously recognizing the relationship that has developed between China and the United States. Now, with regard to Russia and Europe, the conference report enhances our ability to deter Russian aggression, maintains strong support for the Ukraine, and reaffirms our commitment to the transatlantic partnership by calling for a strong force posture in Germany. Now, President Trump also vetoed this legislation because he wants the ability to remove our military from far away and very, very unappreciated lands, in his words. And particularly, this concern about the situation in Afghanistan. First, and I've been into Afghanistan somewhere close to 20 times since the beginning. In fact, I was on the first congressional delegation to go in January after the invasion. So I've tried to pay attention to what's going on there. And one point is that the Afghanis have struggled and fought with us side by side. They have suffered greatly. And I don't think it's right to say they're unappreciative. I think every day they've been suffering casualties. They've been fighting with our soldiers. In fact, in cases, saving and helping our soldiers survive on the battlefield. Second, essentially the provision allows the president to make the decision. In fact, he can waive all the provisions we built in by simply declaring it's in the national security of the United States and communicating that to the respective leaders in the House and the Senate. That's something that's almost pro forma. So the notion that this seriously hampers his ability is misplaced. What it does, though, is signal that we have to be very careful of recognizing all of the equities that are involved in Afghanistan. The fact that there are numerous terrorist groups there and we have to maintain a counterterrorism presence. The fact that, as I indicated before, the government of Afghanistan, the Afghan people in many cases have suffered more than we have in terms of the onslaught of the Taliban and other forces. So again, I don't think that reason measures up to the demands. So, Mr. President, the National Defense Authorization Act has passed for 59 years. We need to ensure that it will pass for 60 years by overriding the president's veto. The House, as I said, has already done that, 322 to 87, 322 to 87. I encourage my colleagues to show similar support to our military personnel and their families to override this veto, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President, let me elaborate a little bit on something that my Rhode Island said about China. I think it's very, very significant that we realize that this is the toughest bill on China that's ever been passed. And that didn't come just from me. That came from the American Enterprise Institute, which has all the credibility in the world. They talk about what the serious things that are going on, and they actually said this bill is the most substantial and consequential China-related provisions since in probably history. Now that's significant because all of us remember, I know that Senator Reid and I have both spent time in the South China Sea, the 7 islands that they are doing right now. China it's illegal, but they have taken over and they've created 7 islands in the South China Sea. When you go down there, it looks as if on those islands they're preparing for World War III, and they have a lot of our allies in that area are very much concerned because they are making a lot more noise than we are, and they're demonstrated very clearly some of the things that they do that we haven't done. Hypersonics is an example. That's kind of the state of the art, the thing that we do in modernizing our military equipment and abilities. And it's been very successful, but they're still ahead of us. So we're in a catch-up mood. And I would say this, that when you go and you look and you see the buildups that they have, I can remember it wasn't long ago until that China, every time they got involved in any kind of an effort, they did it from their own city limits there. But now they're doing it, they're all over in Djibouti and Tanzania and all around the world. And so we made this bill to establish the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. That's a $2.2 billion for a forward posture to put ourselves in the position where we are going to pass, with this bill, we'll pass China. And we are shifting the supply chains away from China in the semiconductors, printed circuit boards, the pharmaceuticals, stimulating the U.S. economy and protecting weapons and the systems and our troops. It brings China's malign national security activities into light to make sure everybody knows what they're doing there. We have a new report in this bill on the true China defense security spending, the new assessments of China industrial base, new list of Chinese companies operating in the United States and making it more difficult for them to do that. It's all in this bill. New report on the fishing fleets that they have out there that extends the successful China military power report, supports Taiwan, a new plan against that is better than anything we've ever done before. And I put this yesterday into the record, all the things that we are doing, just concentrating on the threat that is posed to the United States from the country of China. It's all in this bill. So this is something that we have taken great pride in because we recognize the threat that's posed to our country from the Chinese. So this is a good bill. It's one that deserves an overwhelming support. And I will say one more time, a lot of work went into this, and it's from both sides of the aisle. We were in agreement on it. It had huge margins of support in both chambers of the House and the Senate. So we will have a chance to move procedurally toward that and make that a reality before the end of the week. So I thank you, the chair, and I yield the floor.
Senator for Oklahoma. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett.
We used to have it somewhere up here. Do you need it right this second? No, I just wanted to tell them.
Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley,
No, you're present or not present.
Ms. Harris,
As soon as this is over. So when the leader comes in and tells you, yeah. It shouldn't be as long as.
Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King.
Brad, your guys know they need to stay, correct? Brad?
Mr. King.
Thank you.
Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Loeffler. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts.
We've only got 38.
Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey.
Megan, Senator Young wants a relief. Thank you.
That's right. I think he's got like a flight delay. I think I was told about that.
Pardon?
Senator Kramer's going to have
Mr. Udall.
Yeah.
That's what I was told.
Yeah, if you need like a quick swap out, I can see if someone can give you a little break.
Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner.
It's there's not a senator that could care less about a gavel, to be honest with you.
Ms. Warren.
No, I'm
Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
A quorum is now present. Senate will come to order. Majority leaders recognized. Senate will come to order.
Mr. President, I ask the chair to lay before the Senate the veto message on H.R. 6395, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carver. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collin. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Barrasso, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Bozeman, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Capito, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Crapo, Duckworth, Enzi, Fisher, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Inhofe, Johnson, Kane, Kelly, King, Langford, Leahy, Manchin, Menendez, Moran, Murphy, Reed, Risch, Roberts, Romney, Rosen, Rounds, Sanders, Sass, Schatz, Schumer, Scott of Florida, Shelby, Smith, Stabenow, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Udall, Warner, Whitehouse, Wicker, Young. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Kennedy, Lee, Markey, Merkley, Paul, Sanders. Mr. Hawley, no. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Peters, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Miss Ernst, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Harris, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Braun, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Ms. Sinema, Aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman. Aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer. Aye.
Has any senator not voted? Does any senator wish to change their vote? The yeas are 80, the nays are 12. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report.
Veto message to accompany H.R. 6395, an act to authorize appropriations for fiscal year 2021 for military activities of the Department of Defense and so forth, and for other purposes.
The question is, shall the bill pass? The objections to the President of the United States, to the contrary, notwithstanding, the question is debatable. The majority leader is recognized.
I send it.
Senate will come to order.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the veto message on H.R. 6395, an act to authorize appropriation for fiscal year 2021 for military activities of the Department of Defense and so forth, and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators
Ayes
as
consent
follows.
the reading, the nays be waived.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 12 noon, Thursday, December 31st. Further, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, morning business be closed, and the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day. Finally, following leader remarks, the Senate resumed consideration of the veto message on H.R. 6395.
Is there objection? Without objection.
So with no further business to come before the Senate, I ask to stand adjourned under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until noon tomorrow.